It was the ultimate safeguard against war and division in Europe, but today the European Union is splintering, and the cracks are only getting wider. From bitter infighting to clashing politics, leaders around the world are now questioning whether the EU can hold together, and if it can't, who stands to gain from its collapse. On today's episode of the Infographics Show, we're revealing the secret plan to break up the European Union. Over the last few years, there's been a growing sentiment against the European Union, or EU. Brexit, Britain's messy departure, led to other member states touting the supposed benefits of triggering Article 50, the EU's withdrawal clause. The supranational political and economic union appears to be slowly crumbling, at least depending on who you ask, and how much they stand to gain from it. The idea of European unity was floated after the end of World War II, seen as the antidote to extreme nationalism and fascism. The foundations of the current EU were laid with the Treaty of Paris, established in 1952, that shared coal and steel production aimed to create economic stability in post-war Europe. That was followed by the Treaty of Rome in 1957, which established the European Economic Community. This created a customs union that allowed goods to move tariff-free across member states. Through the tense decades of the Cold War, Europe remained divided between East and West. But by 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall not only reunified Germany for the first time since World War II, it also led to a temporary wave of missile disarmament across the continent. Just 3 years later, in 1992, the Maastricht Treaty officially created the European Union, uniting 12 member states under one banner. 2 decades on, in 2012, the EU was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for helping transform a continent once scarred by war into one of peace. But in recent years, things have gotten a lot more tense. In the 21st century, China has emerged as an economic and political superpower, heightening tensions across the globe. And it is the EU that has felt the impact. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Europe was once again forced to confront war on its borders. Some geopolitical analysts consider the current state of the disorder as a clash between multiple empires, with the European Union struggling to hold itself together under external pressure. And it's not just unfortunate circumstances that are threatening to tear the Union apart. There are plenty out there who want the Union to dissolve. Far-right and nationalist parties have won significant elections both across the European continent and across the world. A major driver of recent tensions has been the rise of nationalist perspectives promoted by powerful states. Around the world, politics has shifted toward more inward-looking policies, and it feels eerily similar to the years before World War II. A brand new Iron Curtain could be forming between Europe and Russia. One of the major problems is that in response to the war in Ukraine, the European Union has struggled to come up with a unified and decisive solution. The lack of any peacekeeping initiative has exposed the glaring power vacuum within the EU, and that doesn't exactly inspire confidence. Power vacuums never stay empty for long, and the EU must decide whether to assert its influence and pursue a peaceful resolution. As the Union hesitates, countries and political parties are seizing the moment, exploiting Europe's tensions to push their own agendas. Across Europe, Eurosceptic voices are getting louder, trying to pull more voters into their nationalist cause. Among them is Marine Le Pen, former president of France's far-right party, the National Rally. Le Pen is pushing the narrative that the European Union is undemocratic and calling for France and other member states to have sovereignty over Brussels. Le Pen has softened the public image of the National Rally, formerly the National Front, by expelling members accused of anti-Semitism and racism. She also has dropped the party's opposition to same-sex marriage and abortion access. But the National Rally still advocates for a lot of the same policies the party had previously pushed for, including a hardline stance of being anti-immigration and pro-economic nationalism, allowing the state to intervene in France's economy. She's also a vocal critic of globalization and multiculturalism, and in early 2025, joined other far-right European leaders in launching scathing attacks on the EU at a rally in France. The National Rally aren't the only far-right party trying to make as much noise in Europe as they can in order to swing voters. In fact, some parties have been specifically founded on the premise of being opposed to participation in the EU. When it was first established back in 2013, the Alternative for Germany, or AFD, was explicitly against Germany continuing to remain a part of the Union. Over the last decade, the AFD have become increasingly more extremist in their views. According to a 2023 report by the German Institute for Human Rights, they are now a radical anti-immigration party that wants to overturn basic democratic order. Members and leaders within the AFD have publicly made a number of anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim, and anti-democratic statements, as well as trivializing the Holocaust. The party leader in the state of Thuringia has even been fined twice by a German court for using the phrase Alles für Deutschland, or everything for Germany. The slogan was used by the Nazis and engraved on daggers carried by stormtroopers of the Third Reich. The AFD has declared the European Union a failed project and openly called for Germany's withdrawal, dubbed Dexit. In a draft election manifesto, the party pledged to remove Germany from the EU and get rid of the single currency that is widely used by many member states, the euro. The proposed alternative is something called a Europe of the Fatherlands. Leaving the EU wouldn't be easy for Germany, even if the AFD were voted into power. Germany's membership to the European Union is tied directly into the German constitution, making Dexit actively unconstitutional. The AFD would need a two-thirds majority in the German parliament to even attempt an EU exit, and party members have openly admitted that including its promise in their manifesto may be counterproductive. Still, the AFD says that if it takes power, it'll push to renegotiate Germany's ties with the EU and the rest of Europe. The Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban is also someone seeking to disrupt the EU's influence. Orban has regularly vetoed foreign policy decisions that oppose the war in Ukraine and has taken unpredictable stances on many geopolitical issues. He has been openly confrontational toward the EU, even putting Hungary in direct opposition to the Union's laws and regulations. When Hungary failed to comply with EU asylum rules, the European Court of Justice imposed a €200 million fine, around 260 million in US dollars. There were also further penalties of €1 million per day. Orban framed this as the country resisting judicial activism from Brussels and a revolt against the EU's interference in their nation. His goal is to weaken the EU's ideological consensus and doing whatever he can to make them seem politically incompetent. Orban has openly admitted that he wants the EU to provide maximum financial support for Hungary's economic growth, pressuring Brussels to release frozen funds to his government. Critics accuse his administration of running a corrupt kleptocracy, taking EU money while painting the Union as a political enemy and funneling those funds into the pockets of allies and relatives. Since assuming office in 2010, Viktor Orban has been gradually shifting Hungary toward what he calls illiberal democracy, promoting even more Euroscepticism and establishing closer ties to both China and Russia. Meanwhile, over in Italy, the ruling party, the Brothers of Italy, has its own share of Eurosceptic roots. Their stance on the EU is in sharp contrast to the Italian socialist movement, the neo-fascist predecessor to the Brothers of Italy, which broadly supported European integration. The Brothers of Italy position themselves as a mainstream far-right party opposed to further integration, though they have not yet called for Italy to leave the EU. Elsewhere in Europe, there's been a swing away from those more Eurosceptic parties. One major example is Poland, where the former ruling party Law and Justice, or PIS, clashed repeatedly with EU courts. Only after Brussels imposed sanctions and pressured the government to support pro-democracy reforms did PIS lose power to a coalition of other political parties. The EU has the power to quell these movements, especially when they oppose democracy. But it's a fine line to tread. Too many sanctions risk being framed by critics as overreach from Brussels, giving Eurosceptics an easy excuse to justify their stance. The fact that anti-European Union movements exist at all is an enormous threat to the unity of the EU, and that threat has been brewing both inside and outside of member states for a while. Arguably, the first major domino to fall was Brexit, Britain's departure from the European Union. Its aftermath continues to cause serious economic problems for the UK, serving as a warning to other member states about the risks of leaving. Brexit was pitched to the British public as a means of regaining sovereignty and control. A lot of the most vocal proponents of the movement preyed on certain parts of the public's views surrounding immigration. Ultimately, a majority of the British public were convinced to vote in favor of leaving the EU, without fully understanding the consequences or what they were voting on. The UK's most Googled search term the day after the 2016 Brexit referendum was, "What is Brexit?" Nearly a decade later, the UK has been grappling with economic downturns and political instability, as well as a loss of their influence on the world stage. In stark contrast to the prosperity promised by pro-Brexit voices, the UK's GDP growth has lagged far behind the rest of Europe. Issues with international trade that were once negated by access to the European single market have led to increased import costs thanks to tariffs. It's been estimated that Brexit has cost the British economy billions in loss of trade and investment. Industries like manufacturing, Financial services and agriculture have all faced struggles thanks to the restrictions on trade, and in a lot of cases, this has resulted in significant job losses and higher costs for consumers. One of the most damaging consequences of Brexit was that it signaled to the rest of Europe and to once fringe far-right parties that leaving the EU was now possible. Opportunists from politicians to corporations have since amplified the same talking points, making similar pushes to weaken or exit the Union. After Brexit, other exit movements started gaining momentum, and while none of them have been successful, now the blueprint exists. Every fresh crisis or hot-button issue gives vocal Eurosceptics more fuel. As economic divisions deepen and financial stress spreads across Europe, the EU has become a convenient scapegoat. Northern European states are told their membership only helps to bail out the debt of the South. Meanwhile, southern nations resent the austerity measures imposed by Brussels. While this plays out, Russia is deploying its own strategy to accelerate the unraveling of the EU. A considerable number of groups with ties to the Kremlin have been openly calling for the dissolution of both NATO and the EU. This has led to the dissemination of disinformation the world over, amplifying anti-EU sentiment. Russia has even allegedly provided support to politicians who align with Moscow's goals to divide Europe. This would not only weaken the sanctions already levied against Russia, but would significantly reduce the United States' influence on the global stage. The United States has played a central role on the world stage, directly affecting the EU and its member states. The dollar has long served as the dominant global currency, while U.S. policies and financial tools such as sanctions have reshaped international markets. At the same time, veto powers within the UN Security Council and procedural limits in the World Trade Organization have weakened international checks and dispute resolution. Together, these have complicated efforts to advance the kind of international trade regulation envisioned by the EU. The EU is battling many problems, but two big fixes could keep it from falling apart: a European defense force and major reforms to the global monetary system. Right now, the Union has no military muscle to enforce unity. Efforts to build a single European defense force keep running into the same political roadblocks. Thanks to the EU's voting system, any member state can veto a collective decision, and this has often gotten in the way of making any substantial progress. This happened before, back in the 70s, when the European money system was introduced to try to financially coordinate the Union. It was only after Germany had been reunified and they agreed to establish the European Central Bank in Berlin that the euro was able to be introduced. So, if multiple major countries want to leave the EU, Brussels can't really do anything to stop them. The same comes with trying to establish military protection for Europe. A dissenting voice can put a halt to necessary changes being made. EU governments often fall into stalemates over defense policy, leading some to argue that the Union must evolve into a fully fledged state with its own military power. A state is only recognized on the international stage when it has an autonomous military force. In this case, the EU army commanded by EU generals acting under the authority of a democratic EU government. Of course, a transformation like this wouldn't happen overnight. It would take the full commitment of the European Parliament and a lot of financial resources, but doing so would not only give the Union a way to communicate, it could also bridge the political divide that exists between the EU's eastern and western members. After the Cold War, the Warsaw Pact countries were integrated into the Union in order to prevent territorial disputes. But a lot of the citizens in Eastern EU countries never received the same level of post-war reconciliation as those in the West. Building a shared defense force for Europe could foster a sense of shared European identity and cement a degree of patriotism to the multinational community. Despite lacking a unified military, the EU has managed to bring its members together in other ways, most notably through the euro, a supranational currency that serves as a global reserve. Yet worldwide debt has soared to 360% of global GDP, meaning that savings and investment are completely out of sync. Add the climate crisis into the mix and the picture gets worse. Fixing resource depletion takes global coordination. The UN should have the money to lead, and just a slice of military budgets worldwide would cover the cost. But in practice, the International Monetary Fund stands in the way because the US holds veto power over major financial actions. In order to solve this issue, the EU could consider a new updated version of the Bretton Woods system, the rules for commercial relations among 44 different countries that were established back in 1944. This system was the first fully negotiated monetary order designed to govern the financial relations between independent states. It required other countries to guarantee their currencies could be converted into US dollars. but a revised EU-centric version of the system could give the same power to the euro. The benefits of a system like this could mean that emerging economies could access international loans from the EU rather than being forced into debt if their currency is weaker against the dollar. A new Bretton Woods could also give the EU greater power to regulate carbon pricing, helping to confront the climate crisis. It would also provide faster financial support to developing nations or those in need of emergency relief. Without a unified military, the EU appears weak, and when that perception is combined with rising nationalism, foreign influence, and widening economic divides, the Union's cohesion is placed under constant threat. The Union becoming fractured isn't just possible, it seems to be increasingly plausible. If the European Union has any hope of surviving, they need to be able to lead a coalition of countries that is fully committed to firmly re-establishing peace and international order. Several institutions like the Bretton Woods system, the United Nations, and the World Trade Organization all need to be reassessed and updated to better suit the geopolitical landscape of the modern day. There may be secret plans to break up the European Union, but one country has already gone its own way. Watch why the UK is doomed after Brexit to see the aftermath, or click on this video instead.